Hello, everybody. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conference. We started out this morning hearing about the many accomplishments that the state conference has achieved, followed by hearing information about the work that needs to be done. And we've received information about resources that can help all of us address some of the social injustice issues. One of the things that the membership committee is going to be focusing in on is the importance of expanding our core of freedom fighters. We know that all of our units have workers, but even those units that have large numbers of workers, we find that we need more people to do the work. So our time is going to be focusing in on how we can expand our leadership by taking a good look at how we as NAACP units can reach out to those younger populations to help us plan how to implement succession planning in our units and be prepared to continue the legacy and the work of the organization. So on behalf of our membership committee, I want to welcome all of you to our workshop, which is titled The Fight for Civil Rights, Approaches for Engaging, Growing, and Retaining the Next Generation of Freedom Fighters. As you can tell from the theme, our workshop is designed to provide units with the information and tools to help us enhance our understanding of the younger generational groups, the issues that drive their social involvement, as well as for us to find ways to engage them in preserving the legacy and the work of the NAACP. It is my pleasure to introduce the presenters for this workshop. And I'm going to begin by introducing Ebony Gadsen, followed by Jeffrey S. Key. The reason why I'm electing to introduce them together is because there's a wealth of information that the two of them are going to present, and I want to make sure that we get all of that information in. So by introducing Ebony, we find that she strives to create a judgment-free zone where people can feel free to be their true selves in individual therapy and group settings. She began her journey in mental health by studying psychology at St. John's University, where she also ran her own correlational study about marriage in the millennial population. She then studied social work at the University of Southern California, and it was there that she honed her skills in therapeutic interventions and program implementation. Ebony currently sees clients at the Princeton Center for Mind-Body Healing in Princeton, New Jersey. Passionate about her work, Ebony has led discussions at various organizations that attempt to encourage healthier attitudes around sexuality and amplify the voices of marginalized populations. Attendees of Ebony's workshops not only learn new information, but they comment on the interactive aspect of the learning experience, which allows participants to retain information long after the workshop is ended. When she's not reaching and teaching, you can find Ebony perched somewhere with a hot cup of tea, looking for new things to add to her Pinterest board. Ebony possesses an MSW and is also a licensed social worker. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Key. Jeff Key currently serves as a consultant with Infinity Enterprises, providing website design, technology, and operations consulting to small and mid-sized nonprofits and businesses. He previously worked in the nonprofit sector for more than 15 years for a number of New Jersey-based education nonprofits, serving students from middle school through college with a focus on providing equitable access to educational services, mentoring, and college counseling for students and families. He currently serves on the board of the Center for Nonprofits, the State Nonprofit Association for New Jersey, and is a national board member for the Young Nonprofit. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from Princeton University and has a Juris Doctor degree from Seton Hall University School of Law. Outside of his work with the nonprofit sector, Jeff enjoys hiking, listening to interesting podcasts, discovering new music, and watching movies. He is a lifelong resident of New Jersey and currently lives in New Brunswick. Now, to help us get started with the conversation, I want to begin by asking our presenters 3 questions, which I then will allow them to take the lead and respond to those questions through their presentations. The first question is, when you hear NAACP, what comes to mind for your generational group? The second, what can NAACP units do to engage, train, and retain members of younger generational groups? And the third would be, how can younger members ensure that the work of the NAACP continues? So Ebony, I'm going to allow you to start first, and Jeff, feel free to chime in along the way. And I know that our timekeeper will keep us in line.
Perfect, great. Well, first I want to thank you all for allowing us this opportunity to be here and share this information with you all. I am representing the millennial generation, and so I want to share with you, kind of the definition breakdown of all the generations, because I think we can get a bit lost about where one ends and where the other begins. And I think that will help frame our conversation about what the input is, what millennials and Gen Zers will bring to the NAACP as an organization, but also how you can increase your outreach efforts for these specific groups. So I actually started doing a lot of research about, like, what do people think of when they hear the NAACP? Because I think that's part of the barrier, right? And so in a just rough social media poll with majority millennials, I'll share some qualitative feedback that I received. I don't know if I have permission to advance the slides, but on the next slide, it's not too different, but I'm just gonna share some of the overall themes where that the NAACP helps Black people, does a lot of great work, a lot of historical activism. There were some that were not so positive, that it's outdated, which is shared by some other fellow activists in the nonprofit sector. And that's why we're here, right? We're hoping to change that narrative, because that's certainly not the case. We know that NAACP is doing work today, every day, but I need to increase the awareness about that, specifically for millennials and Gen Zers, who are a little bit more out of touch with the history that's so rich here. They're not sure what they really do. And I put really in quotations, because I think there are a lot of loose themes associated with the NAACP work, but there's not a lot of tangible ideas that millennials or Gen Zers are able to speak to. Oh, I know that they lobby Congress for this, or I know that they're part of prison reform, for example. Like, that's really specific change agents that they're really not able to hone in on. So let's go ahead and define these generations on the next slide, just to see what each group is contributing. So I would say the traditionals and baby boomers are who we can credit for really shaping the rich history of the NAACP. You can see the years that they were born are at the top for each generation. So between 1900 to 1945 for traditionals, 1946 and 1964 for baby boomers. And their experience is shaped by these events in history. So that's what you'll see in that second column that I tried to put it's not necessarily lining up due to formatting stuff, but that shaped, right, these generations, how they look at the world, how they perceive themselves and their role in society, but also certain technological advances that kind of mark the sign of the times. So the automobile, the television for the traditionals and the baby boomers was really significant. Now, when we get into Generation Y, which is where I'm going to be referring to millennials, but that's the official generation marker. We get into tablets, smartphones, these really personal devices. So even just seeing this transition from a technological advance being something like an automobile to now being something like a tablet or a smartphone, it's very, very drastic, right? So that's shaping the whole experience, and it's shaping how you do activism. It's shaping how you show up in the workspace. How you choose to communicate is going to be important for how we do our outreach efforts. So a letter might have been really effective once upon a time, or telephone marketing might have been a great way to get people engaged in previous generations. But now we're seeing that texting, DMing, any kind of handheld device messaging system is really going to be critical for these younger people, these new generations to come, for getting them involved. It has to be very accessible. That's kind of the theme of today's age, being able to get people where they are, meet people where they're at. That's a phrase we use a lot in psychology. So I think it's important to kind of, if you see me looking down, I'm looking at my notes here that I don't have up on these slides, but I think it's important to consider how they look at social justice issues because of all these technological shifts and differences here. So where there might have been, a lot of emphasis on, what would I say, more collective social justice issues, now we're seeing things that are maybe more of an individual space, but they're really marketing around like, who is the quote unquote underdog? We want to rally behind who doesn't have a voice. So that's why you're seeing a lot of language now about, using correct pronouns, right? You see, even in my name, I have she, her, Aya. So that way, I'm making a statement, even just with my name in my, Zoom box. So this is very our generation to be looking at who doesn't have a voice and how can we speak to those experiences. So just that slight shift, it just gives you an idea of how these brains are thinking. I also think it's important to note that the historical shifts impact how they make decisions. So I would dare say for millennials also, but really for Gen Z, the economic downturn, especially of 2007, that recession that they witnessed their parents go through, they witnessed the generations before them struggling financially, has really created this this prioritization of financial stability, which I think whenever you look into like, why is it hard to get young people involved in activism and nonprofit sector work, right? Like it's the main barrier seems to be that, they don't want to do something they're not getting paid for, just to kind of like really be candid about it. And to some extent that's true, but to another extent, they've watched this kind of like generational trauma before them and they're not willing to repeat the cycle. So what that means is they're actually the generation that's bridging that gap between the for-profit and the nonprofit sector, which can be a great thing, which actually opens a lot of doors for us, but it causes us to have to think really creatively about what the work looks like going forward, if that makes sense. They're also even considering a company's ethics, cause work, and employment decisions. This is definitely true for millennials. So a lot of millennials don't even really have brand loyalty when we're shopping in a store. We're looking at, well, if this company came out and there was some not so great or problematic news about them, we might not buy that product anymore. Like that's really how we're doing activism. So that's quite different from previous generations before, where it might have been more of a collective, okay, we're going to boycott a certain venue or a certain institution, we're making these very individual decisions of, I can't get behind this because it's not good for the environment, for example. So me and my household are no longer going to buy this product. I also want to say that millennials value inclusion. I think this is also true for Gen Zers. Gen Zers are probably going to take it to the next level. So we'll wait around to see more about where that goes as they start to, Gen Zers are just getting to the place where if you were born in 2000, you just turned 21, this year, 20 or 21 during the pandemic. So they're just really starting to get out into the world and make their imprint on society. So we'll see what it looks like. But as far as inclusion goes, I think that really is a great thing for the NAACP to focus on, because it is the advancement of colored people. And I think from a lot of the polls and surveys that are done about what are attitudes about the NAACP by people that aren't affiliated with the organization, they're just not aware of how inclusive it is. So we'll get into a little bit more of that in the next slide, but I thought it was important to just kind of meditate on this piece for a second, and so you can see these differences. So I wrote a few phrases that kind of just drive the point home about how millennials feel in general about certain things in society, but I try to keep it really streamlined to social work and nonprofit activism. So millennials value social issues over institutions, which for an organization like the NAACP, having such a rich legacy actually doesn't work in favor for a millennial standpoint, because that legacy almost creates a challenge. Like, okay, well, what are you doing now? Or what kind of issues are you addressing that we can really tangibly put our finger on, like I was saying before. So I think really pushing that out in our marketing is really going to get them on board. It's really going to create some emotional buy-in of, oh, wow, I didn't realize they were doing all of that. That's totally what I'm on board for. I just signed a petition for that last week, and we'll actually get them involved and interested in membership. What I just said, millennials consider a company's cause, work, and employment decisions. So everywhere they go, they use their money, their time, their energy to really create powerful decisions in our society. And that's how they're merging these lines between the for-profit and nonprofit sector again. They believe their time, energy, and skill set hold equal value, which I think is interesting and has been kind of a barrier when you work with millennials and Gen Zers in nonprofit sectors. And I'll get into this on a barriers. There's a barrier slide coming up shortly, but that's one of the main issues that we have when we go into places, is that maybe our time is valued, but the energy isn't valued, or maybe the skills we're bringing, especially if we're talking about social media or technology, maybe those are valued, but maybe our time isn't, because we don't have the experience to back it up, right? So the understanding that this is how millennials and Gen Zers think, this is their emotional background, is really important when working with these populations. Millennials also believe in their own power to create change, which kind of goes back to this first point about them valuing social issues over institutions. If you think you can do something yourself, then where's the buy-in for you getting behind a whole organization? So we have to kind of sell the idea that we're greater as numbers, right? The sum of the whole is greater than its parts. I think that collective aspect of it is going to create some buy-in for these younger generations to feel like their contributions are really making an impact. And there's a good amount of distrust about institutions, which I think is a bit fair for what they've been watching. And, in our upbringing, we've witnessed so much institutional, what do I want to call it? Just really misuse of power. So really we have to have some true buy-in and trust for institutions that we are getting behind. And millennials prioritize inclusivity and champion marginalized voices, like I was saying, even about gender diversity, including pronouns everywhere we go. That's something that's very a marked thing about the millennial generation. There are a lot of other things too, though. You'll see that Black Lives Matter is even a movement that millennials have totally gotten behind, of all different races, because this idea of like people who don't have their voices being heard is really, it speaks to them in a unique way. So these are the things that we can keep in our mind's eye when we're trying to reach out to them, that, okay, this is what makes their heart sing, or this is what they're thinking of. So you can kind of like play the game that way, right? So on the next slide, we have a few barriers, which I hope will be helpful. So like I said, young people do tend to prioritize paid opportunities, and, you know, kind of rightfully so. We're very afraid of being poor, very afraid of being broke. And we also have a lot of student loan debt. We have the highest student loan debt numbers out of all the generations. Inflation is to blame for that. We also suffered, just like our parents and previous generations did, from the economic downturn. And so job opportunities just aren't there. So oftentimes, if there's a paid opportunity versus a nonprofit opportunity, a young person is going to take that paid opportunity that will also get them that experience. It's very much like an efficiency model. So what I've noticed, you know, in the social work field, a lot of nonprofits doing that's really effective is bringing, even on an intern level, bringing young people in and getting them valuable work experience that they can put on their resume to get these kind of like higher position jobs that somebody in a higher generation might get, or older generation might get, because they had the experience. But now that they've had this experience at a younger age, they're more qualified. So that's a real way to involve them and create that buy-in for them, because they know ultimately that this is kind of where it's going as far as their career trajectory. Millennials and Gen Z tend to not feel valued in the workplace. And this information comes from multiple surveys asking millennials who have been in nonprofit spaces and even social work organizations, companies, like, when you are working in these fields, how do you feel that your contributions are? And they often experience a bit of tokenism. I know it seems strange to use that word when we're talking about age, but we know age discrimination is a thing, and it happens with young people too. So to give you an example of what that could look like, if I'm hired for a company and I have a master's degree and I happen to be very skilled at what I do, but you really only bring me into the team meeting to talk about social media or text marketing or things that are very like innovative technology things that you think are quote unquote young person's job, then that might not feel like a meaningful task for me. Or if I'm forever the intern or forever the administrative assistant, but never given, you know, never rising in the ranks of the company, then that doesn't feel like value. Because again, that financial insecurity is there for the millennial and Gen Z population because of what they've watched their parents go through. They aren't aware of how inclusive the NAACP is. And I think that this is really important. This is something that the NAACP can totally push out a bit more about how they, even the founding, right? The organization was founded in 1909 by majority white liberals. And I think a lot of people don't know that. Especially when people are commenting back on just a survey poll saying that, oh, I know they do a lot to help Black people. They do a lot to help all people, especially people of color. And so I think that that would be a great way to really get people involved and increase engagement, specifically for millennials. So at this point, I will turn it over to Jeff and look at some ways to engage them.
Perfect. Thank you, Ebony. And it's a great lead-in to some additional discussion around ways to really engage new, younger generations So myself, similar to Ebony, I identify as millennial, but I have a lot of experience working with younger populations even now, and in preparing for this workshop and continuing to work with high school and college students. As a millennial, I knew Gen Z was a thing, but now finding out that there's another generation, Gen Alpha, and it's defined by various years, but really starting in 2010, which to me, I can vividly remember what I was doing at that point. But looking at these younger generations, speaking from my own experience, like when I was younger, at a time before social media, before interacting digitally was even really a thing, and now being in a different stage of my life and kind of being on both sides of that equation, working with younger generations where they've just had a different frame of reference for their entire life. So mostly Gen Z, if you're thinking about folks who were born around the year 2000, certainly this generation Alpha, of folks who were born starting in 2010, they're really digital natives. So if you were born in 2000, by the time you're old enough to really kind of have awareness about what's going on, these are folks who've grown up in an era where social media was natural. They likely had access to internet, cell phone, all of those social media networks. And so I can think back to when I would have been younger, there was no digital option, right? So your first point of contact and getting involved with activism or advocacy or awareness was really in person. And I think that's a really important kind of distinction. If you're talking to these younger generations, these are the types of folks who the first time they might find out about an organization or get involved with an organization is through a digital avenue. That could be email marketing, it could be finding out about an event, or connecting with an organization on social media. And I think it's a huge shift to think about. And I know when I've been working with college students in the past, I always like to tell people I stopped for a certain amount of time with my social media engagement at Snapchat. I think I made it from Facebook to Twitter to LinkedIn, maybe to Instagram. And then once we got to Snapchat, I was just like, that's beyond me. Like, I'm not engaging there. And I've kind of branched out and been able to broaden my thought process since then. But really, if you're thinking about engaging new generations, I was really happy to catch the tail end of the last segment and that magnificent performance by that young lady from, I think it was the Maplewood and Orange area. They don't lack for passion and awareness of the issues. I think the way that they connect and their default way of finding out about organizations' information is just very different from earlier generations. So if you're not really thinking about, okay, we need to engage on social media and hook these folks in, I think that's just naturally the way they've grown up and the way that they make first contact with organizations. And that might be their bridge to attend an event, or want to find out more about an organization or connect to a website. And so I think being able to meet them kind of where they are in their comfort zone can be a bit of an adjustment, but is really, really important. I think in terms of calls to action, they think about social media and engagement. If you're on any of the social media networks, you look through your feed and you see there's so many options out there. There's just a much broader range of things competing for their attention. And so if you're an organization and you're thinking about how do I reach kind of younger generations, we want to bring them in, we want to get them engaged with our work and make them aware of what we do, you have to cut through more noise than you have in the past. And I think as I've done more and more work in terms of social media and engagement and outreach, I think one thing that I've realized, and I think this was raised on the previous segment, folks talking about local media and avenues, where are people getting their information from? And I think the more that I've learned about social media and even my own experience is, if you're not familiar with social media, sometimes they can think, you can think we need to be really slick. We need to have flashy production. And I think in a lot of the conversations I've had with folks from younger generations, so either Generation Z or even now, folks who would be considered in Generation Alpha, so high school students who've grown up with social media, is yes, they pay attention to what's on their feeds and what pops up in their social media, but I think that they're really, really aware of, maybe more than we might think, and connected to authentic stories and authentic content. So someone who is passionate about, civil rights. I know at this moment, having a huge debate and resurgence of issues around voting rights after the last election and what states are doing now and bills that are being passed at the state level. And young folks are very, very aware of that. But I think they're looking for kind of authentic content, and knowing what I know about the NAACP and their work and their history, what younger folks are seeing now and younger generations are seeing now isn't radically different than what people were seeing during the civil rights movement. It might look a little bit different. It's really just a remixed version of that, right? So you now have all of these state bills that are trying to be passed to restrict voting on the state level to make it much harder to vote. And I think younger folks are very aware of that, but I think there's a gap there in that some of the work that the NAACP has been doing for a very long time around that, of sharing that engagement and being able to connect these younger folks to make connections with older generations who already fought these fights in some sense, and be able to offer them some advice and really to provide some mentoring, and also being able to learn from them in terms of social media engagement and how to, continue this fight for years to come, because it's an issue that has now come back to the forefront. So we can jump to the next slide. I try to think through some characteristics of the different social media networks that are out there. And one thing that I would offer from my own experience and just working through this with different organizations is your local NAACP unit might have particular goals. And one thing with social media, I think to do it well, you want to have a focus. So I tried to put together just kind of like a quick chart of some of the popular social media networks that are out there with younger folks. If you're looking at this slide, and one thing that jumps out that might surprise you is that Facebook is not on here. As someone who remembers when Facebook first got started, when I talk to younger folks now, they tend not to be on Facebook. So those things progress as well. And for a lot of them, it really is kind of quicker engagement. So you're not necessarily going to be able to have a full conversation with folks. But I think this is where younger generations go for information, for engagement, to really find out who's putting out content that really speaks personally to me. So I think, as Ebony mentioned, issues like student loan debt, pay equity, Gen Z, and I think increasingly Gen Alpha, who's that really young generation. I know during the pandemic, I was on LinkedIn and other social networks pretty frequently. And one of the things that really jumped out to me was companies putting out statements, and some of you may remember this dynamic. After I think the murder of George Floyd came to light, it seemed like every company out there was putting out statements on social media, whether it was LinkedIn or Twitter, Black Lives Matter. And I remember getting emails from, companies that I bought socks from, who were like, we care about Black lives. And people pushing back on social media. And it really was younger generation saying, I see the statements you're putting out, but we have questions. What's the racial makeup of your board? What's your company's plan for addressing, pay inequity? Or I looked at your senior leadership team and it doesn't seem like you have a diverse group of senior leaders or any Black people or people of color on your board. And so I think when you think about the social media content that you put out, the authenticity is really an important thing. But I think that at its core, social media is the next avenue of people being able to have, I think, an increased measure of control over storytelling. So who owns the media outlets? How are you able to get kind of visibility and access to large audiences? And I think Gen Z, millennials, Gen Alpha, they in some sense look at social media as the great equalizer. So I don't need to get an interview on like a traditional media outlet to get my message out. I think it's important for organizations to realize that, to meet those folks where they are, but then to be very intentional about thinking through what's the way that we want to reach out to folks and get them involved in the work we do. So knowing, what I do about the NAACP's work around voting rights, around civil rights, around criminal justice issues, I think being able to translate that into one or more of these social media networks and get that message out to young folks to bring them in the fold becomes really, really important and critical to, I think, being able to keep up the momentum of the work that the organization is doing. And so if we can jump forward to the next slide, I think you don't have to create a massive presence on every single social media network, but being able to think through strategically, like, what is our goal for reaching out to folks? Are we looking to educate people? Do we want to have calls to action going out on any of these social media networks? I think it is vitally important to have some type of plan to meet these folks where they are, so that they see your message, they know the options there, and to be able to bring them in the fold. I think one of the things that I'm consistently impressed by is young folks have the passion. A lot of times they just need the connection and the platform and the context to be able to translate that message to their peers effectively. I know I've had pretty good success in just, okay, maybe I'm not the messenger that needs to bring this message to folks who are in the same age group or dealing with these issues. But if I can find some really passionate young folks, bring them into the discussion, give them the tools they need to be able to bring this message out to their peers, I think almost without fail, they've done an impressive job of being able to take that baton, run with it, and use social media effectively, or be effective messengers to bring other people in their generation to the fold, and help them realize, like, okay, what we're talking about and the issues that we care about are just the next version of some of these fights and some of these issues that the NAACP and other organizations have been carrying on for generations. And so I think there's a certain amount of ownership that's really great to be able to turn over to them, in a sense, and bring them into the fold and really kind of give them the freedom to craft that message and bring that message to their peers. And I think it's better received. It comes off as more authentic in that way. And I think when you combine some of the wisdom that folks that have been doing this for years can impart to them, and some of their passion and energy and new ideas, that then becomes kind of an unstoppable combination. But I think it's kind of a marriage of both things. And even though some days I look at social media and I cringe a little bit because there's a lot going on there, I do think on the flip side, it is a really powerful tool when you have your messaging and you have folks who are bought in and are trying to put out authentic messages to cut through a lot of this misinformation that's out there, that it can be a tool that pushes forward a lot of progress.
Jeff, if I may ask a question, would you share each of these social media outlets with the audience? Because maybe some of us might not be familiar.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll kind of give a brief synopsis, and I have some notes here. TikTok is one that I am not on yet, and I think my first impression of it was, okay, there's a lot of dance videos on TikTok. There's a lot of music information. And as I dug a little bit further in, I think all of these platforms lend themselves to the content that you really emphasize. So the more that I've looked at TikTok, it tends to be shorter format videos. So you're not going to be able to put maybe like a 20-minute video on TikTok, but it can be kind of a great hook to be able to make a call to action, be creative with the content you put out. And I think one thing that I've had to get more comfortable with is we're all on Zoom a little bit more these days, thinking about social media. But a lot of content that goes on TikTok has the possibility to go viral, and it could be a good way to make someone more curious. Click on your website link to learn about more, especially depending on who you're able to get to serve as a speaker or a messenger for the information you're trying to put out. LinkedIn, I think, tends to be more of a professionally centered social network. So if you were trying to look at younger professionals, so I put there the key audiences, millennials, Gen Z. Yes, people are there for professional advancement, but I feel like if you were looking for volunteers who have a certain level of professional background or specific skills, LinkedIn is kind of, I like to call it the Facebook for professional people. Tremendous amount of members. You can create smaller groups. You can post articles. You can post event registration info. So there's a lot of options there. Instagram is the next one. So one thing that I've done recently that was not on my radar at all, for me, Instagram for a lot of times was following people's feeds and seeing what photos they posted. I got invited to actually do an Instagram live talk. And so you can do live video and interviews with speakers, folks who are doing advocacy work that other Instagram followers can follow in real time or watch recordings of, that can really kind of pull them in and get them involved with your organization, the work that you're doing. I'd say Twitter is probably a much shorter attention span. I'm on Twitter a lot. And for me, I see people post educational posts, educational threads. If you wanted to highlight upcoming events, advocacy issues that you think people need to know more about, it's kind of people don't need to see your content live. They may choose to follow you. And as long as you're posting consistently, I know I follow a lot of interesting organizations on Twitter and are able to find out about events they're hosting, see videos that they post, see calls to action. Maybe they want me to contact a legislator or sign a petition. And I think that the audience there is pretty massive. And it tends to be something that very popular with Gen Z, even Gen Alpha, also millennials as well. And then Snapchat, I think, is definitely something that's focused more on younger generations. I personally do not have a Snapchat account, but I know that a lot of younger folks that I've worked with in a volunteer setting or that I've worked with in my past nonprofit work, they're on that platform. It really can be a great platform for folks to share their live experience at a convention, say. If you have younger folks attending a convention, if they're posting on Snapchat and saying, hey, I'm live at the NAACP state convention, here's what's going on, I'm watching this amazing speaker, people with followings and people who post really think interesting content, again, it can be a great hook for someone to see that story and go, hey, my peers at this NAACP state convention, they're talking about this amazing speaker they saw. I need to check out their website. I need to find out more about this this organization that someone's posting about. And then finally, YouTube, which I think a lot of us may be familiar with. I think it appeals to a wide variety of audiences. And YouTube, you can post everything from a 30-second video to a 5-minute, maybe even 20-minute, 30-minute video with like a recorded interview. But I think it allows you to have a variety of approaches. You know, are you interviewing speakers? Do you want to do a quick call to action? Do you want to have an educational video? And I think the great thing about a lot of these is in the past, you may have felt like I need to have kind of a certain amount of production value. It's pretty straightforward to be able to film something on a cell phone these days, even the pretty high quality camera. And I think don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I'd say with social media, getting started is the most important thing, and posting consistently so that folks know where to find you and how to engage with you.
Thanks, Jeff. One of the things that I just want to bring to everyone's attention is that we did have a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to read it, and then Ebony, I would like you to share your answer with everyone. We are really quickly running out of time, unfortunately. The question was, I am recently introduced to the she, her, ella recognitions, and I'm trying to understand what this means to the individual whom uses these identifications. What is considered by she, her, ella of now being introduced to this type of identification that may not identify themselves in this manner? So Ebony, could you briefly share your answer?
Yes, and thank you for asking. It's so important that that was asked. I think a lot of people don't ask, and that's kind of, you know, the problem, right? So what it is it allows us to assert how we want to be referred to, either to our faces or behind our backs, about our gender identity. And I think the issue that we saw, especially in my field, being that I specialize in sexuality, is that people that do exist outside of the gender binary of she and he, right? Like if you are gender diverse anywhere outside of that, you're outing yourself every time you have to share with someone what your correct pronouns are. So if we all do it, even cisgendered folks, people who are express their gender the way that they are, the way that they were born, I think that, or whose gender expression matches the biological gender they were born with, I think that that allows it to be a safer space, but also just in general, you know, it's a very preventative and proactive measure to prevent people from misgendering you. So I've even had cisgendered women. My mom is a cisgendered female who often wears a short haircut. And if she doesn't have earrings on, she'll be misgendered. People will, you know, not refer to her with she, her pronouns. And that can be quite offensive to anyone. So imagine if, you know, you do have a gender identity thing going on, or that causes you some dysphoric feelings, then, you know, that could be a psychological issue. So that's part of that inclusivity that millennials value, that, right? Like using these.
Thanks for that clarification. We have one more question that time is rapidly passing. Next question is, activism tends to yield results that aren't measured by profit. It leads to creating a road to profitability. How do we convince the young to understand that activism is a vehicle to profit, and sometimes it's necessary to delay profit for the greater good or promise?
Well, I think, sorry.
Go ahead, right ahead.
I think that's part of the change that the younger generations are shifting, that they really are merging the two. They really are merging the for-profit and nonprofit sectors in a way where that delay is kind of shorter and shorter. So you'll even see like people partnering with certain brands in order to allow a social activism initiative to have some funding. A lot more young people in social work are even looking into grant writing because they understand the power behind a fiscal budget. So I totally hear what you're saying, but I think for young people, that's the change that they're trying to create. Even when I was in my MSW program, it was a lot about talking about how you set your rates and valuing your time accordingly.
Okay. As you can see, there's a lot that we still have on the table for future discussion. And I've just been informed that we have about 4 to 5 minutes left. And I don't know if there are any other questions in the chat that we might address. I don't believe. The one question that comes up here is, does the statement about the pronoun usage bypass Mr., Ms., Mrs., Ms. that's currently in use?
Bypass in what way? So, a lot of the places I'm in and a lot of the spaces I'm in, we're not using those greeters. So I think that's also a shift that's happening with younger generations. Everyone is kind of on equal playing field. That's part of that inclusivity as well. Even when we're talking about age, when we're talking about rank, in my practice, the supervisor does not lead the clinical rounds. It's a shared experience. Everyone pitches in. So there's a lot shifting, even just about how we utilize power.
Okay. Comments on the slide that's up by you and Jeff?
So, I would just add, in terms of using social media, I have this discussion with clients sometimes. Social media is a very broad thing. I can't even keep track of the networks that are out there. And so I think for any organization, any branch, really thinking through what your engagements are or engagement goals are is key, right? Is it, I want to reach a really large number of people. I want the broadest audience possible, because that could direct you to certain social media networks. Or is my goal okay, I have a very specific set of goals. Maybe I need high event registration, or if I'm working in advocacy, what's important to me isn't necessarily the number of people I reach, but I need people to sign a petition. I need people to contact a legislator. I need to get people involved at a really hyper local level, because I have a very specific aim. Is knowing what those goals are. And I think once you have those outlined, you'll be able to do kind of a much more focused job on, okay, this is our capacity. This is what we're able to do. Maybe we focus on posting consistently on 1 or 2 social media networks for this set of goals, because I have seen small businesses, nonprofits say, we're going to jump on 9 social media networks at once. And as someone who spends a decent amount of time on social media, there are not enough hours in the day, in addition to everything else that you have going on, to be able to post on everything with the same level of consistency. So I think knowing what your goals are as a local organization is the first step. And then you can almost look through the social media networks with a filter and even say, hey, if I'm posting on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, this is what we're focusing on. It's not necessarily to get as many followers as possible or retweets, or we know we need people to sign up for our upcoming major event. I think that focus really helps with, okay, I don't need to do everything well because that's just overwhelming, but okay, for our top 2 goals, we know we need to be engaged on this way. And I think it also just makes things more manageable for your leadership team and your membership to say, hey, we're focused on getting really great registration for our upcoming signature event or upcoming conference. And that's what everyone's going to be focused on for the next 3-6 months. It'll keep you from being overwhelmed.
Thank you, Jeffrey. We have one more question from our Marketing and Communications Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman C. Wright. I just had a quick question about, as we've been speaking about like this divide, and I appreciate your speakers, but one thing that we often hear every year is people speak about the youth. We mention the youth, but then every year when we look at the different leadership and the different branches, you still don't see a lot of youth leadership. So my question is, because we're talking about the digital aspect, which is very much a part of the young people's lives, it would be in everyone's best interest to have young leaders, because that means you automatically have someone who knows how to use these digital tools. So I guess my question is, like, we talk about it often, but I don't often see the follow through. And I'm curious, is it more so the young people aren't making themselves more accessible to meeting the older generation where they are, or is it the older generation is more resistant and isn't letting go of the reins enough? And that'll be like one more question before we get to our DJs.
I think it's a bit of both, Marcus. I think that you raised a really important point. I think, unfortunately, there are a bit of, I'll call them microaggressions that can happen, especially in a working environment when young people are involved. Kind of like what I touched on a bit earlier about like young people not feeling valued in the workplace when they're working with other generations. But I also do think that young people feel a bit of imposter syndrome when they're in spaces. So they do need a bit of encouragement and empowerment that you've got this, you can take this on, and we know that you can handle that. I also do think that if they're not aware that these opportunities are out there, I think a great example is the fact that Millennials and Gen Zers are still signing up for the military, even though they value social issues over the institutions. Militaries say that they're going to train you and give you this expertise, and you're going to leave with skills and maybe even be able to pay for college. And so if organizations offer that same kind of, we're going to bring you in and show you how to lobby Congress and show you how to, do these things that we're doing and walk your hand through it, you'll leave with these resume builders, or you'll continue to grow in this company, then I think you'll see more engagement.
Well, I think that we've come to the end of our time, and it seems like it just flew by. We're just beginning to engage in discussion. But one of the things that I do want to say to all of the attendees, this is not the beginning and the end of this discussion. The information that was shared today will be taken back and reviewed with members of our membership committee, and looking at the possibility of developing a survey for all units to complete, looking at our membership based on generational numbers, to see how we going forward can incorporate exclusivity, I can't even talk, exclusivity, you know what I mean, getting people involved so that we can make sure that we're including everyone in this fight to preserve civil rights. And I can't thank our presenters enough for taking the time from their busy schedules to get involved with us. And again, this is an example of reaching out, getting people involved. And I am very pleased to say that both our presenters will be visible in units in our area in the very near future. Know that we need to spend a lot of time focusing in on embracing younger potential members, giving them meaningful jobs to do within our units. And there's a lot of knowledge and skill and expertise within the units already, but there's also a lot of possibilities out there that remain untapped. So thank you all for participating. I hope that you find have found this session to be informative and certainly to be a continual discussion in the months to come. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
What a wonderful panel. You know, we've been trying to make sure that the annual convention is intergenerational, and that hit it right on the head, right? We recognize that that is how we sustain the mission of civil rights. And my hat's off to you, Roz, especially during a very difficult time. You managed to pull off a very, very phenomenal presentation. And thank you, Ebony and Jeffrey, much appreciated.